thought it was interesting what you were saying about, half the country not wanting anything to do with this because, when I was asking you about the whole, do we just think we're better than everybody else? Like our military is just bigger, et cetera. I think if you just asked any, you went, did the whole thing where you just walked down the street and asked people, what do you think about the US military? Like, is there a threat to us in the world, et cetera? I think most people will say that, you know, we're, if anything, too big, right? Like we're spending too much money on the military, et cetera. And I wonder if this is something that is because the American people haven't been communicated with the way that you were saying before, in terms of like FDR having his fireside chats, or if it's that there hasn't been something to kind of shock us the way that 9/11 did 20 years ago, to change how we did things. And like, what do we need essentially to try to unite the country again?
First of all, I agree with everything you just said and inferred. If the invasion of Ukraine isn't sufficient, I don't know what's going to be. So in that sense, yeah, I say this advisedly, obviously, but maybe Putin has done us a favor by pulling the covers off of, where he stands and what he's trying to do. But there's no telling whether it's too late and so on. This is the big question in my mind, is whether we're up to it, first of all, and whether or not we have time to do what has to be done, because it takes time.
What do you think we can do now to take advantage of the Russia-Ukraine timing to shore up our power in the Pacific vis-a-vis China?
I think it's again, I use the term advisedly. It's a good story to tell, and it has to be told well. That's the first thing. The second is that these are not separate things. This is a global situation. You've got exactly what we haven't wanted for the last 130 years or more. We haven't wanted there to be an antithetical coalition in Eurasia. And now there is. So if we're going to stick with that, then we have to tell that story, say why it's important, connect the Moscow-Beijing dots, and start articulating, and I wish I could do a better job at this, of how Xi Jinping is going to advantage and collude with what's going on in Ukraine and in Moscow and with Putin. When described in those terms, if done properly, this should raise the level of threat and anxiety and requirement to a point where perhaps we can overcome our basic lack of preparedness and divisions at home. Perhaps. Remember, in 1938, the French would just as soon fight with each other than with the Germans. And that really ensued almost literally throughout World War II. So there's no guarantee we're going to get this right. American solidarity and unity has come often enough, but it's by no means been eternal or consistent.
Yeah. France in World War II is definitely not the model the U.S. should adopt.
It's not just that they lost, but they made some bad bets. So they decided militarily to concentrate on fortifications and stability on the battlefield and centrality of command. And unfortunately, that didn't work out for them. At the same time, politically, they were so divided, the left and the right in France, that they couldn't come together to decide what to do and whether or not to do anything with regard to the Germans. And then, of course, the rest, as they say, is history.
My gosh, we are France in World War II.
No.
Well, I mean,
It's an interesting comparison.
I was thinking when you were talking, Paul, about the Space Force and how obviously the next war is going to be a space war, and how much sense it made when you put it that way, that like, of course, people are going to be destroying satellites, etc. And yet when the whole idea that the US should have a Space Force was proposed by Trump, it was just like treated like a joke, essentially. And I think part of that was because obviously like half the country doesn't like Trump. But what did it become? It became a Netflix TV show about, the incompetence of the US government, essentially.
I mean, it seemed cool when Neil deGrasse Tyson proposed it like 10 years earlier. Right? People thought, oh, that sounds good.
I don't know if people thought that. I think people just were surprised that he came out and basically said, no, it's a good idea when Trump said it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think people thought it was cool 10 years before when Neil deGrasse Tyson said it, because I don't think people think anything to do with a military buildup in the U.S. is cool right now.
No, that's maybe true.
I'll probably spend the rest of my professional life trying to make the Space Force a naval force. We'll see how far I get with that.
Well, so one of the things you mentioned earlier about the sort of vulnerability of our networks in space and our cyber networks, which of course are linked. We could have the biggest, bestest naval fleet in the South China Sea and in the
Technical
Pacific.
term.
The bestest is technical. It means the number one, absolute bestest. We could have the bestest, and then the communications go out, right? But is there like a World War II era communication strategy that we could have as like a backup in place that would allow us to operate without the sort of technology that could be knocked out by the Chinese rocket force or whatever?
First, I'm not sure because I'm not a technical expert. I majored in history, so I know some of the history. In World War II, the closest corollary would be the command and control of the submarine forces, where there was very little, but relatively little transmission on the part of the submarines because they were vulnerable, but a lot of command and control from fleet headquarters.
So they could receive it, but they wouldn't send the signals.
Yeah, and I don't want to overstate that because there was some transmission, but when it became increasingly obvious the vulnerability of submarines that were transmitting on the radio. In fact, as it turned out, the Germans kind of never figured that out, and we took them apart because not only were these messages going out, but we were reading the codes, so that's part of it too. So their communications were terribly vulnerable to our code-breaking efforts that we and the Brits were very successful at, including with the Japanese. And so we were, as an example, reading the cables being sent back to Tokyo from Berlin by the Japanese ambassador to Germany, who would be called in and briefed on what Hitler was thinking, and then basically Washington and London would know about that before the rest of the German high command. It worked out pretty well. I don't know exactly what the analogy is going to be now, but I think maybe the lesson here is that there are these wars going on in the airwaves. And that's some of it's going to be deception, some of it's going to be interruption, some of it's going to be exploitation, and so on. Cyber's more than that, but also so are our networks, all of which can be either fortified or not, and leveraged or not, and so on. I think, however, that prudent commander would think of operating without them, without resorting to them. Okay, and I don't know, but it looks to me like every time you hear a naval officer, I shouldn't say every time because I don't track it that closely, but they keep repeating, no, we got these networks and our strategies, our capabilities are all dependent upon, this network. And now we're doubling down on that. So the idea of a fleet broadly dispersed. Well, in order to supposedly avoid, a single blow, defeating blow, decapitating blow. Well, the problem with that is that increases even more your dependency on these networks, especially when 150 or 200 or more of these vessels, I guess, are going to be unmanned. Well, artificial intelligence hasn't been proven in the first instance, let alone going forward, and you're going to have to be telling these vessels what to do constantly. So this is a technical problem that hasn't been sorted out.
Right. I'm not sure I'd want to enable an AI run destroyer, for example. Would we want to authorize an unmanned destroyer to open fire on a target?
None of this has been worked out. The Navy has bet its future on it.
Well, really, like the message I'm getting from you is that, like, right now, the U.S. Navy reigns supreme on the seas as long as no one challenges it.
It's been challenged. It's increasingly obvious that it's been challenged. I wrote the first unclassified analysis of the anti-ship, the mobile land-based anti-ship ballistic missile put together by China. That was sort of the death knell of those presumptions of the Navy reigning supreme, and it become the centerpiece. It's not the only part of it, obviously, but it's the centerpiece of the so-called anti-axis area denial Chinese strategy. I've seen not much from the Navy that has in any convincing way. Of course, some of this at least, probably most of it, is highly classified technically, right? But the Navy needs to tell us. The Navy needs to ensure that we're not putting good money after bad in whatever naval acquisitions and operations we charter. But no, so I know you were kidding, but no, I wouldn't say that at all. That's the point. I think that's the fundamental point. I wouldn't say that at all.